and maybe give you an overview of what the book is about, the legacy of Mullah Nasruddin. Okay, so the reinterpretation of myths and folklore has been an essential genre in literature. From the ancient Greek world to our contemporary societies, authors have reinterpreted old tales to forge new social criticisms. Our book, Mullah Nasruddin, The Making of a Modern Trickster, is a historical exploration of such a genre among Azerbaijani-speaking people of South Caucasus. The book looks at the milieu in which the periodical Mullah Nasruddin was born, the manner through which the journal reproduced the trickster trope of Nasruddin for its audience, and the influence of European graphic arts on its cartoons and illustrations. The key to this very successful cultural melange was the creative use of the trickster figure as a medium of social criticism. The traditional wise fool, which we know him in the Iranian, Turkish, Arab world by various names, Hoja Nasruddin, Goha or Joha or Mullah Nasruddin, broke conventional boundaries of thought and morality. It revealed the hypocrisy of the existing social reality, ridiculed the overbearing theologian, the conceited scholar, the lazy aristocrat, and the autocratic king. So using the tropes of the folk Mullah Nasruddin, with which every child is familiar in the Middle East, the periodical Mullah Nasruddin also brought down to earth and debased powerful contemporary figures, creating space for new ways of thinking about relations of power in society. Now, the region we're talking about on the left, you see, is the South Caucasus. It used to be part of the Safavid Empire until 1722, and then became part of the Russian Empire. And today on the right, you see it comprises the countries of Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, as well as parts of South Russia. Russian colonialism differs from its British and French counterparts in some very important ways, other than the fact that they had been in close proximity, the Russians and the Middle Eastern people, so they knew each other pretty well. The Tsarist Russia settled on a policy of religious toleration towards each minority community in its empire, instead of forced religious conversion or expulsion. But they also set up an elaborate administrative system to employ and control the religious establishments. So in the Muslim world, administrative offices work closely with Muslim clerics to implement Sharia law in family matters, and in the process had created what Robert Cruz has called an Islamic church for the Shia Azerbaijanis, which historically did not have a centralized doctrinal authority. Now, of course, Muslims, Jews, and other non-Christians were considered third-class citizens after Russian Orthodox Christians and Catholics and Protestant denominations. The Russians saw the Muslim population as exotic, backward, and even dangerous, as people who needed to be disciplined and educated by the state. So we can use terms like Orientalist and colonialist to refer to the conduct of the Tsarist authorities. But the Muslims in this region were not powerless subjects of the state. By 1905, there were a number of extremely wealthy, cosmopolitan Muslim industrialists in Baku who wholeheartedly supported the prospect of religious and educational reform in the region. They established their own newspapers and journals, theaters with a strong group of playwrights, multiple charitable societies, private schools for girls, as well as many other modern institutions. This cultural renaissance was an indigenous movement and by no means a colonial enterprise. Indeed, Tsarist regime was reluctant to support these efforts at religious reform, especially the education of Muslim girls, because it feared the backlash by the Muslim clerics with which it worked closely. Now, in 1906, a group of artists and intellectuals published the journal Mullah Nasruddin. They reinterpreted the tales of the Middle Eastern trickster to construct a progressive anti-colonial discourse with a strong emphasis on social, political, and religious reforms. The founder and editor of Mullah Nasruddin was Jalil Mehmet Qolizadeh. He is commonly known as Mirza Jalil. He was an Azerbaijani educator, a teacher, and a playwright. His wife, Hamida Khanum Javanshir, was an early Azerbaijani feminist and a philanthropist. There were a number of gifted contributors on the staff. Ali Akbar Tahirzadeh Behzad was a brilliant poet who revolutionized Azerbaijani literature. Abdurrahim Beg Haqverdiyev was a playwright and stage director and a member of the First State Duma of the Russian Empire. Mehmet Said Urdubadi was a prolific correspondent and writer who covered the revolutionary events in Iran during the Tabriz Civil War of 1908. The principal artists were Oskar Schmerling, Joseph or Yusuf Roter, and Azim Azimzadeh, who together were co-founder of the art of caricature in South Caucasus and Iran. And the journal is considered a founder of a satirical school of thought in Azerbaijani literature. By using folklore, visual art, and satire, their 8 to 12 page weekly, which had full-page color lithographic cartoons, reached tens of thousands of people across the Muslim world, impacting the thinking of a generation. The most creative period of the journal were the years 1906-12, when a talented group of artists, writers, and poets were staff members. And these were the years that coincided with the Iranian constitutional revolution and also the Young Turk movement, events that were reflected in the journal. The 1880s oil boom in Baku and the spurt of industrialization in certain parts of the Caucasus brought European and American investors, as well as migrant workers from Iran and the Ottoman Empire to the region, leading to significant economic growth. As more wealth was generated, economic inequity of the region widened, particularly in the city of Baku. New political parties were formed, especially various social democratic organizations affiliated with the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, both the Bolshevik and the Menshevik branches of it. Tiflis, where the journal was published, was the administrative and cultural capital of Tsarist Russia's southwestern peripheries, and it was a magnet for artists. A majority of his residents were Armenians, with large numbers of Georgians and Russians, but the city also had a small Shia Muslim population. There were both long-term Caucasus Azerbaijanis and migrant workers from Iran. It was a vibrant center of politics, an eclectic cosmopolitan city where artists, playwrights, and journalists of these diaspora communities interacted and added to the city's cultural diversity. Mullah Nasruddin soon captured the imagination of a wide sector of the Muslim world. Historians of South Caucasus and Iran have called the birth of the journal a historic moment in the annals of the region. In its first year of publication, Mullah Nasruddin had a circulation of 25,000, of which 15,000 were subscribers inside Iran. With its large circulation, it reached a much wider audience in the coffee shops and bazaars of South Caucasus, Iran, the Ottoman Empire, and as far away as Egypt and India. It was read aloud in these spaces to diverse groups, including many illiterate urban workers and rural peasants. And we have stories about peasants coming and asking somebody in the city to read them something they found in the journal that they were just absolutely mesmerized with. The periodical faced immediate and implacable opposition. South Caucasus and Iranian clerics issued fatwas against the journal. Still, it was smuggled across the border into Iran and other countries. Mirza Jalil's brother and other staff members routinely crossed the border to Iran. They distributed the periodical in Tabriz during the Civil War and in the trenches. They had also had embedded reporters who covered the constitutional revolution and the Tabriz resistance of 1908-09 from the ground. I would like to emphasize that the journal was not anti-religious. It was the first publication in the Shia Muslim world to unapologetically reinterpret Quranic verses in light of modern social norms, including girls' education and a greater reform in marriage and divorce laws. So you find articles and cartoons, opposition to child marriage and forced marriage, for example, this one, easy male divorce laws, polygamy, this one, for example, man taking a new wife, temporary marriage, known as sireh or mut'ah in the region, pedophilia were among many of the topics that the journal addressed. Mullah Nasruddin called for freedom, justice, and constitutionalism. So if you see with the banners here, Hurriyat, Idolat, Qanun Asasi. Many writers of Mullah Nasruddin work with the Social Democratic Himmat Party, Muslim Social Democratic Himmat Party. And they were committed to his platform of fighting for social reform and against political despotism and religious orthodoxy. In the pages of the journal, we see many criticisms of sacrosanct Shi'i rituals, particularly self-flagellation, Sinazani, during the festival of Muharram. So this one is our nation's army. So this is a cleric and the self-flagellants, and then the Russians' army at the top, for example. They have many things like that. The artists of the periodical played a crucial role in its success. They mingled modernist and social democratic artistic influences with older humanist traditions of classical Persian poetry, creating a new cultural and artistic discourse. The goal was to highlight the violence and hypocrisy of the European powers and to critique indigenous social and cultural practices. So here, Satan, this is Satan, who is European politics, is enticing the people of the region to push the bull of their livelihood into a valley to be carved up by these imperialist powers down here. Tiflis was quite an interesting city at the time. You had German, Polish, and ethnic Russian artists coming there, and they played an important role in the artistic renaissance of the city. They taught painting, drawing, sculpture, and architecture at Tiflis art schools. And then the local artists were inspired by these European artistic conventions. Gradually, we see a triangular relationship. Students start attending the Tiflis Fine Arts Society. If they're good, they go to the St. Petersburg Academy of the Arts. If they're better, they go to the Munich Academy of Arts in Germany. So Schmerling, one of our principal artists, studied in all of these three schools, and then he met Rotter at the Munich Academy and invited him to come. The graphics and cartoons of Mullah Nasruddin belong to a tradition of satirical arts that stretch back to 18th and 19th century European lithographic art, especially influenced by the Spanish artist Francisco José de Goya and the French artist Honoré Daumier. But they also drew upon newer forms of caricature in British, German, and Russian satirical publications, and the critical realist school of art, which was just developed in Tiflis and St. Petersburg. So the first one on the left you see is a classic work of Goya, and the right is from the journal Mullah Nasruddin, very similar things. Now, European conventions of caricature were problematic. They were based on many racist, sexist, and Orientalist views of the East and involved the pseudoscience of physiognomy, which is the melding of human and animal features in discussing the characteristics of different nations into their cartoons. So here you have a cartoon from the British Punch. This is on 1882 after the Urabi Revolt and British occupation of Egypt. And you see various countries represented by animals. So the lion is always Britain, the bear is usually, they're always the Russian, and the crocodile here is Egypt. The idea behind physiognomy was that one's appearance determined one's character. So those endowed with European definitions of beauty were seen as inherently ethical and moral, but people with physical deformities or unattractive features were seen as morally corrupt. Satirical and illustrated European journalists, including the British Punch, used elements of physiognomy to suggest that there was a racial hierarchy among nations and people. Now, Mullah Nasruddin also used physiognomy, but the application of physiognomy here was along ideological rather than racial lines. Clerics, merchants, and political leaders and traditional women who opposed modern education were drawn with typically unflattering features such as angry eyes, long noses, and animal features, suggesting they were conceited, corrupt, uneducated, and generally untrustworthy. So for example, here to see how they were inspired, on the left, we have a cartoon from the British Punch. Prime Minister Gladstone and the Women's Federation is the subject of the cartoon. On the right, you see a similar theme, but here we have a Qazvin cleric and his many temporary wives. So you can see the influence, but you can see how they dramatically change it and reinterpret it. Now, success has many claimants. The Azerbaijan Republic celebrates the periodical as a founding contributor to modern Azerbaijani nationalism. Iranian historians also claim the periodical as, quote, one of their own, because many members of the editorial board came from immigrant Iranian families, and because there was a large volume of articles and graphics about Iran in the periodical. And the Georgian Republic also has a claim on Mullah Nasruddin because it was published in Tbilisi. And of course, it's two of its main artists were Georgian Germans. But in reality, we argue that Mullah Nasruddin belonged to a transnational diasporic society. In this region, Russians, Caucasus Azerbaijanis, Georgians, German, Armenians, Iranians, Jews, and other ethnicities of a variety of religions, cultures, and political persuasions mingled on a daily basis and shared a common territory. Indeed, the theme of diaspora, of living in transition between cultures, of crossing border, is a very prominent one in Mullah Nasruddin. Many things like this one, crossing of the Aras River, going back and forth. Now, as a transnational periodical, Mullah Nasruddin never limited itself to the local concerns of the Muslim Azerbaijanis. Rather, from the very beginning, Mullah Nasruddin saw itself as a mouthpiece for other persecuted Muslim populations and even other colonized people around the globe. The editor and several writers of the periodical grew up in Azerbaijani-speaking Shia communities with strong affinities to Iran. And so we can't think of a journal as a transnational diasporic periodical in Azerbaijani that was heavily influenced by Iranian culture and social practices. But there were others influences. Like many other diasporic communities, the writers of Mullah Nasruddin felt torn between their close ties, religious, cultural, and ethnic ties to Iran, their desire to assert their Azerbaijani language and cultural heritage, and the need to further assimilate within the greater Russian society to succeed professionally. And so this feeling of in-betweenness, of wanting so deeply and passionately to belong to one place or the other, and yet finding there really was no one place where could one find oneself at home, vividly comes through in many columns and poems. And here you have the Azerbaijani who's forced to speak these various languages, Arabic and Turkish and Russian. And he says, you know, I've got my own language too. There were other transnationals. The associate editor, Omar Faik, had strong ties to Turkey, where his family was from and where he had studied. He'd been involved with the Ottoman constitutionalists, and he was an experienced journalist. And still others, the artist Oskar Schmerling, who grew up in a Georgian German community in Tbilisi, went to Munich, as I said, and studied there, and Joseph Rotter, who was a newer immigrant, a German Jew, who came also from Germany to Tbilisi and became part of the editorial board. So the preoccupation of a journal with the migrants was not due to any intimate familial ties. Rather, it stemmed from their social democratic political leanings and cultural ties, as well as their longing and sentimental attachment to their Iranian heritage. In its most creative 6 years, we discuss in the journal, the editorial board wrote about 4 major political events: the Russian Revolution of 1905-06, which brought a constitutional reform and a free press; the Armenian Muslim Wars of 1905-07, which saw the devastation and pillage of hundreds of Armenian and Azerbaijani villages; the Iranian Constitutional Revolution, which brought a parliament and constitution to Iran for the first time; and the Young Turk Revolution, which restored the Ottoman constitution. All of these events were discussed and analyzed in the pages of the journal. Finally, Mullah Nasruddin lived through World War I, the 1917 Russian Revolution, endured the Russian Civil War, when briefly the editor came to Iran for about a year and published it there, and then returned back It joined the Azerbaijan Democratic Party, Mirza Jalil, and finally lived through the establishment of the Soviet Union. But as the authority of Joseph Stalin, also from Tiflis, grew more draconian in the late 1920s, the fate of the contributors to the periodical was sealed. The Central Committee of the Azerbaijan Communist Party decided that the periodical would now be called Allahsiz and become the organ of the League of Atheists, Allahsizlar Ittifaqin Oqanina. And as you can imagine, what that did to the journal, which had been so very, very careful with issues of religion. Mirza Jalil died of natural causes in 1932, but with a broken heart soon after the name change. Hamida Khanum, his wife, lived on through great hardship, but she wrote her memoir of their remarkable life, and it's one of the few documents we have actually on their personal lives. Some of the writers perished in the turbulent 1930s. Some remained quiet. Some became propagandists for the Stalinist regime to survive. A few tried to protest, and as a result faced brutal years or death in the labor camps of the Gulag. Still, the lasting legacy of Mullah Nasruddin is with us. The journal exposed the colonial and imperialist policies of the great powers in the region. It called for greater dialogue and friendship between rival ethnic and religious communities, so the Shias and Muslims, the Armenians, for example, and Muslims, the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, and so forth. It defied the Shia Muslim religious establishment in South Caucasus, Iran, Najaf, and argued for a more progressive interpretation of Islam, opposed, for example, anti-Semitism in the region, among others. It chastised the landowning elites of the region and became a mouthpiece for the impoverished. It initiated a radical discourse on gender reform and called attention to the plight of women and children. And so for all these accomplishments, Mullah Nasruddin will forever be considered a true literary gem of the early 20th century. And I'm very pleased to let you know that BBC Persian just produced a documentary mainly based on our book, which was aired this fall, and I have a little clip of it which I can't show, but it's hopefully they will also produce it in English because all the interviews were actually done in English. So I hope that in this way the journal would actually become more available to a much wider audience. Thank you very much for your time.